something that's simultaneously unsettling and compelling about people who live in places where it's barely possible to live. Partly this is because of how we talk about them, the way information flows amongst humans. Information flows from larger places to smaller places, less so than the other way. For example, millions of people live in or have been to New York, Tokyo, Beijing, King's Landing, Lannisport, Old Town. There's rumors and falsehoods said about all places. Every place is subject to rumor, but there's millions of people who have experienced those places, New York, Beijing, King's Landing, firsthand. Millions of people who know the truth, or at least some form of it. This is way, way less true about the remote places few people have been to. There's far fewer people who have experienced it, but a lot of noise about what people think about it. There's rumors and a lot of things that aren't from firsthand experience. It's just rumor and talk. And when people repeat these rumors, well, there's rarely a person with firsthand experience to set them straight. Because there aren't a lot of people to set them straight. People who live in these remote places, well, they're not common to encounter, are they? And rumors grow the more people repeat them. The bigger a population center is, the more almost any discussable subject will be discussed. Their bigger places are rumor mills, right? And that tamps up, increases the level of exaggeration, or just straight up mistakes, or even lies. It's a telephone game, basically. Someone may claim the members of House Farwynd, our subject today, are different, or strange, or both, or they're skinchangers. But the vast majority of people who speak about the Farwynds know little about them. They've never been there, have probably never had a meaningful conversation with someone from there, right? What about academic texts? I mean, the same thing goes, really. There's no indication the maesters have gone out of their way to study Lonely Light or the rocks around it. I mean, there must be some maesterly writing on it. They are a noble house, so they've got to have a maester. I mean, unless there's an exception here we haven't heard of. But even among the maesters and archmaesters, these kind of texts would be on the fringes. You just wouldn't have a lot of other maesters interested in the subject in the first place. And that's true not just with the noble houses there, or the noble House Farwynd, but their subjects, they're small folk. They're a little different too. So what people think about the fringes of the world often come from places that are nowhere near those fringes. So the information is less readily available, more subject to inaccuracy, mystery, rumor, all that. But that's fun, isn't it? Houses like Farwynd, and I use the term lightly because there aren't truly houses like House Farwynd, really. But there are houses that fit into that general category of hard to explain, remote, touched by the supernatural, or several of the above, or just different, right? In terms of houses that have the least in common with other houses, if that's a category, Farwynd would be in it. And the Ironborn in general are a people apart from the rest of Westeros. They've had a long time to grow culturally separate from most of the rest. Now, House Farwynd is a house apart from even the Ironborn. So they're like a house apart from the houses apart. Their sigil is a long ship with a sunset behind it. Raiders of the Sunset Sea. It says it all right there. Long ships, that's what you expect usually when they're coming from the Ironborn. It's about attacking. Sometimes it's about trade or what have you. But if you're going to be trading, you want to use a ship different than long ships. They don't have that much space. But they're strange, they're isolated, they're dreamy, they're possibly supernatural, possibly holding deep knowledge of the West or of the depths, or both, or other things that we haven't even fathomed. How many houses are rumored to skin change into sea creatures? Honestly, I think this is the only one. It's not something we hear of in the North, other than green seers who can supposedly slip into the skin of any animal. Right? But Bran hasn't done that. Bran has done birds and animals, and we haven't seen him slip into a fish or a squid. I mean, that would be cool, and it's presumably possible, but he hasn't much reason to do that. What's down there for him to look at? It would be pure curiosity, I suppose. Which, hey, that's a good reason, but plot-wise, maybe there's not such a reason to go there. This is a supernatural realm we haven't really seen firsthand. Well, maybe if you count Patchface, but he's not exactly able to describe it well. But he is a candidate. That's a weird connection, right? Patchface and the Farwynds. Yeah, it's not very grounded as an idea, but you can see where I'm going with that, I think. And this type of topic in general is close to my heart and my geeky brain because it's very wide open. As I said, for theorizing, for imagination, for expanding the boundaries of George's world building, for the enjoyment of mysteries of the sea. We're dealing with the vast, wide oceans of the West, but it's a sandbox, a big supernatural sandbox that this all fits into. And it's the sort that doesn't exist anywhere else in this world that we know of. The Sunset Skinchanger pirate raiders that live farther west than anyone in Westeros and rule more territory than you probably thought. Just one example of what you might not know about House Farwynd that we expect to set straight in this one. All that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome back, everybody. So happy you could be here. If you're attending live, it must be 3 p.m. Eastern on YouTube because that's when we do that. Sundays, we're live most Sundays at 3 Eastern. Afterwards, you can find us still on YouTube, but you can also find us on Spotify. The edited version goes up about a week afterwards. And the audio goes up everywhere as well. And you can find that on any platform that has podcasts. And if you listen on Patreon as a member, it's ad-free. Shout out to our good friend Nina. She, of course, is our most valuable contributor by far. And her blog is at goodqueenalley with 1l.tumblr.com. Her latest blog post is a comparison of the death of Hagon Blackfyre. That's the one who was killed in the Third Blackfyre Rebellion, the king that wore the crown and bore the sword. The comparison is to him and Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales. He was the only son of King Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. Yes, so that is an interesting one. We talked about this particular Prince Edward and several other Edwards during our episode on the Wars of the Roses. So check that out if you're so inclined. But first, read this blog post so you can find your bearings and see what Nina has to say. If you have questions for us, send them to westeroshistory@gmail.com or just put them in the live stream. If you're here watching, then put them in the chat. At the end, I'll mention some episodes that relate to this one so you can stay immersed if you so choose. Let's get it going with a trivia question. There's been Alyssa Farman, there's been Brandon the Shipwright, amongst famous mariners, but which Greyjoy wanted to explore the West beyond the Lonely Light and find those potential lands to the West? What was their name? Answer at the end. Let's have our section headers. These are the different subtopics that we'll be dealing with today. Our first mention and first appearance, which is something we almost always do with houses and characters. Next, founding and geography. Then the Lonely Light. Then Sealskin Point. Then addressing the rumors. That's when we'll talk about skin changing and stuff like that. Then we'll take a quick break and come back with visions of the Sunset Lands. And then some talk about IRL, in real life, remote islands discovered by chance or wind, similar real-life circumstances to Lonely Light. Then accent marks, we're talking a little bit about accents and things like that develop when you're in an isolated location. The Farwynd timeline in history, which will help us understand their place in history. It's a little imprecise, so we're going to take some guesses and try to narrow that down. The Black Line, which refers to House Horror, which is probably when the Farwynds came to be during that dynasty's existence. Then we'll talk about the Conquest and Beyond, post-Targaryen, including Balon's rebellions, and the Kingsmoot, where we see Gilbert Farwynd. And that will be a lot of good stuff. Let's get to it. Starting with a poll, have the Farwynds actually discovered lands to the west? Are they skin changers? So two different questions. You can answer yes, 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 no, no, yes, or no, no. So no to both, yes to one, depending on which, or yes to both. Let us know what you think. Or hold off on that until you've heard our takes on these. We may change your mind. In general, House Farwynd reminds me, in terms of other episodes we've done, of Mantaris, Gagassos, maybe Hardhome, other remote places with supernatural stuff going on that's not well tracked, researched, or understood. Yeah, fun stuff like that. Differently than those houses, House Farwynd annoys the map makers. You gotta make the map a lot wider just to include them, and they they're so small. Like, so a lot of times you see like an arrow saying Lonely Light this way, and you don't actually include it on the map. So just, yeah, the people that aren't included on the map, isn't that kind of symbolic? Isn't that kind of telling? They're so isolated. What's that?
Or they do the little box where you like put it on the map, like they do for Hawaii and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, in Alaska. Yeah, you see that. You're right. U.S. maps often have Alaska or Hawaii like at the bottom or in a corner. We're like, this is part of it too. That's what the Lonely Light would be if Westeros drew maps like that. Yeah. So our word of the day is probably fringe. You'll probably hear that one a lot. Maybe remote. We'll be using those words a lot. Well, our first mention. We always like to start with that. The Farwynds actually appear first in the appendix of A Storm of Swords, but interestingly, it's the junior branch, at least the branch we think is the junior branch of them. There's two branches that we'll talk about. The list is a principal list of Greyjoy vassals, though, parsed by island. The Farwynds in this appendices context are listed among the 5 major houses of Great Wyk. So yeah, the Farwynds of Lonely Light are not exactly a major vassal. So you can understand why only the Farwynds of Great Wyk are listed, because Great Wyk is an important location, and they just wanted to list the important houses on that isle, which they are, even though they might be the least important of those 5 and the most interesting. So yeah, those things don't always go together, do they? Yeah, there wouldn't be much reason to mention the Farwynds of Lonely Light, because they're not a big military power, and that's usually what is being brought up. That's usually why relevancy, what makes things relevant in this context, unless they're also a big part of the story, which they're not, at least not to this point. And so they wouldn't be very interesting to someone like Balon Greyjoy when he's hosting his longship. He's getting ready to have a rebellion. He's not like, well, I sure hope the Farwynds are with me, you know. he's forgotten them for the most part, maybe, or like a lot of other kings or Ironborn, he doesn't really want to think about them too much. Kind of just pretends they don't exist, or doesn't spend a lot of time wondering. Just kind of thinks about other things. How unique they are, their characteristics, and what that tells us about the world and the world building, the suggestions, the reading between the lines, that's what makes them interesting. The mysteries of the seas to the west, that's what makes them interesting. And those are very interesting topics. These are big, enduring mysteries of the world of Westeros and beyond. So yeah, it's not their military power, it's not their role in the wars to come, yet their placement is still fascinating. First appearance. When we first see them, it's in, of course, the King's Moot, A Feast for Crows, right at the beginning, as Aeron first asks who would be king over them. Quote,
"The crowd began to stir, like men waking from a dream. Each man looked at his neighbors to see which of them might presume to claim a crown. The crow's eye was never patient, Aeron Damphair told himself. Mayhaps he will speak first. If so, it would be his undoing. The captains and the kings had come a long way to this feast, and would not choose the first dish set before them. They will want to taste and sample, a bite of him, a nibble of the other, until they find the one that suits them best. Euron must have known that as well. He stood with his arms crossed amongst his mutes and monsters. Only the wind and the waves answered Aeron's call. The Ironborn must have a king, the priest insisted, after a long silence. I ask again, who shall be king over us?
I will,
came the answer from below. At once a ragged cry of Gilbert, Gilbert King went up. The captains gave way to let the claimant and his champions ascend the hill to stand at Aeron's side beneath the ribs of Naga. This would-be king was a tall, spare lord with a melancholy visage, his lantern jaw shaved clean. His 3 champions took up their position 2 steps below him, bearing his sword and shield and banner. They shared a certain look with the tall lord, and Aeron took them for his sons. One unfurled his banner, a great black longship against a setting sun.
I am Gilbert Farwynd, Lord of the Lonely Light.
The Lord told the king's moot.
It's somewhat fitting that a Farwynd, isolated, disconnected from a culture that's already a world apart from most of Westeros, might have missed the implied strategy here. He may not have been aware of the whole don't go first aspect of things. It's appropriate to assign to a house that is not included in as much. They're isolated. They're not as a part of these cultural traditions, these ideas, these common thoughts. And it doesn't work, right? If he was thinking that maybe he would try something different, yeah, it didn't work. Not at all. Has poor gifts. He speaks about exploring lands to the west. He's not talking about the kind of things that Ironborn normally want to talk about, conquest and domination and glory. Yeah, he's speaking to some entirely other thing that they don't really get. He seems odd to them. I mean, it calls him, he's sort of like an anti-Euron, the inverse Euron. He is also mystical and somewhat distrusted like Euron, but he has faraway experiences, or claims to, and has promises of a land of plenty. It's just to the west rather than the east, right? And Aeron goes on to describe in his internal monologue the Farwynds as a queer folk. I mean, he should talk, right? More on that later, but Lord Farwynd's lantern jaw. Let's talk about this description briefly. It's kind of subtle, but maybe telling. Generally, a lantern jaw just means it's angular or protruding, or both. It's the jaw either is thin or it sticks out beyond the upper jaw. Now, a mild lantern jaw can be a good thing in terms of classical, attractive, masculine features. And this guy's tall. He doesn't appear to be like frail or weak, so it's not described necessarily as like a unattractive thing. It can make your face look narrower when your chin is long, and Gilbert is described as having a melancholy visage, so I think this would enhance the effect. He's maybe a little bit gaunt. Nina says it's a bit of a death's head effect, too, which fits with Aeron's distrust of him, and presumably a lot of other people around don't trust the Farwynds either, if Aeron doesn't. Clean-shaven is a bit of a subtle feature here as well, because clean-shaven is rare in Ironborn culture. So this is something that marks the Farwynds as different, even though it comes off as mundane. You might miss that. Easily to miss that. Like, how many Ironborn are shaved? It's pretty rare. Carl the Maid is called Carl the Maid because he's beardless. So I don't know that you'd acquire a nickname for something that's particularly common. Like, how many the Maids are there? You know, you got Coral the Maid, you got Balon the Maid, you got Victarion the Maid. No, it's just him. Now, it also seems that Gilbert's sons are clean-shaven too, so it's like the whole family does that, and an unusual thing to see among the Ironborn, and all of them here are doing it. So George is using subtle methods as well as the more frontal approach with describing them as skinchangers and having this mad speech and all that. But there's all the little details. There's a lot going on there too. As for the lantern jaw, a little more on that. There's a possibility that what George is saying is that this guy is, despite being isolated and stuff, he's not like undernourished or something like that. He's not malnourished. He's not weak. He's weird. He's mad. They use the word queer a lot, but it isn't necessarily weakness. That I don't think that's necessarily what they're contributing. Poor, yeah, okay. In that sense, they're not militarily strong. But when you have an extreme lantern jaw, that's the Habsburg chin, right? So that's inbreeding, which really isolated location like this, they might have a little bit of that. I suspect there's some Farwynd cousin marriages and the small folk intermarrying. The gene pool isn't super diverse, though it might be more diverse than we would immediately guess because of reaving. They would bring thralls and people that they stole from elsewhere, and a lot of those people would become permanent residents of Lonely Light or Sealskin Point, and thus some of them would breed. You know, they would have children, and the thralls have children. That's not uncommon. So yeah, that's kind of a weird little angle to that. Let's get to founding and geography. Let's get a look at what we're dealing with in terms of location and all that. Quote,
a secondary island grouping lies 8 days' sail to the northwest in the Sunset Sea. There, seals and sea lions make their rookeries on wind-swept rocks too small to support even a single household. On the largest rock stands the keep of House Farwynd, named the Lonely Light, for the beacon that blazes atop its roof day and night.
It's a stirring image to have a lighthouse that never goes out. You know, there wouldn't seem to be a lot of reason to have a lighthouse during the day. Maybe there is, more than I think. I'm not a mariner by any means, so what do I know? Certainly it would, I can say without having to guess that it's more valuable at night. But anyway, it's not cheap to do that, I guess. But this one thing they would have in abundance is blubber oil, right? Seals and whales and sea lions and all that. There's plenty of marine animal fat for that. I don't suppose it's the other kind of oil or an other kind of oil. And the light would be vital. I mean, you've got this remote location where there's nowhere else to go. So you really would maybe find yourself getting lost easily without that beacon. It's probably very important to the surrounding isles. And it's, as we're told, it's not just Lonely Light. It's not by itself. There's a bunch of rocks, a bunch of small islands around it, some of which are inhabited, some of which aren't. It's not clear on which is which, how many, but there's definitely some of each, it seems like. And Nina suggests it's possible, too, that like the Three Sisters and the Botleys, there's a use of the lighthouse aggressively. Like they lure people into traps and steal their stuff. I would not put that past Ironborn raiders. Right? Like surely they wouldn't do that. No, they would do that. I don't know that they do, but they would. You know, there's nothing moral or ethical stopping them from doing that, not in their worldview. So it's very possible. Let's get a little more precise here, though. Fire and Blood gives us a little more information. Quote:
Map makers tell us there are 31 Iron Islands in the main grouping off Iron Man's Bay, west of the Cape of Eagles, and 13 more clustered around the Lonely Light, far out in the vastness of the Sunset Sea. The major islands of the chain number 7: Old Wyk, Great Wyk, Pike, Harlaw, Saltcliffe, Blacktide, and Orkmont.
So 13 islands plus Lonely Light. I wonder if all of them can see the lighthouse. I would suspect they can. I mean, there's nothing else out there. And just a little bit of light, even if you can't see the whole thing, just like a glow in the distance would be telling. You know, unless you're seeing the sun, which I presume these mariners and folks that live way out there could tell the difference. So that's kind of wild, right? You've got all these, as isolated as the Farwynds are, some of these other people living on these even smaller islands, whether they're also Farwynds or just small folk of the Farwynds, what are they, the farther winds? They're shunned even harder. Even the Farwynds shun the farther winds, except by the farthest winds, whoever the farthest out west is, right? So I don't think all 13 of those are inhabited, but it sounds like some of them are, and those people might be even queerer than the Farwynds. But like I said, maybe they are also Farwynds. It's unclear whether do the Farwynd cousins, are they scattered all over these islands, or are they all kind of in the two major locations of Lonely Light and Sealskin Point? Probably, I would guess the former. They're probably scattered a little bit, but I don't think there's lesser lordlings, but there might be, you know, people that have authority over others. I doubt it's just Farwynds and nobody else. And of course, let's not forget how the Ironborn operate. On a ship, every captain is king, that kind of thing. So there's a little bit of different set of hierarchy among the Ironborn anyway. And with these islands so isolated, maybe they do some things a little bit differently in terms of all that. Maybe a captain is even more a king on their own ship, given how vast and empty and how important it is. But well, that's part of the guesswork we're doing here, the exploration, the imagination. Let's talk about Lonely Light specifically. So 1,000 years after Brandon the Burner, which we'll talk about that a little more in detail later, but for now I'll say we don't actually know when that was either. But 1,000 years after Brandon the Burner, the first Farwynd found the isles they now call home as detailed here. Quote:
Their captain built a tower and a beacon there, took the name of Farwynd, and called his seat the Lonely Light. His descendants lived there still, clinging to rocks where seals outnumbered men 50-1. Even the other Iron Men considered the Farwynds mad. Some named them selkies.
Selkies, if you recall, selkies have come up a few times in our episodes, almost always to do with island houses. They're mentioned at the Shields and in a few other legends around Westeros and elsewhere. Selkies are a thing in the real world. They are just that, seals, half seal, half people, or people that can change from one to the other, shapeshifters that can turn from seal to human. So that's interesting. 8 days sail northwest of Great Wyk. That's pretty far. We earlier speculated that they probably do have a maester, but they might not have ravens. Because I don't think a raven can fly 8 days sail without taking a break. I really doubt that. It's possible, but I kind of doubt that. So that makes them even more isolated than we would have first thought. Because at least with ravens, you get news. But they can't get news by raven. They can only get it by ship, I think. And ship 8 days sail, that's slow. And then 8 days back, responding and all that. I mean, yeah. There is something that was going to come up later that I want to bring up now. A real-world method to do with ravens. There was a guy who was nicknamed Raven Floki. Yeah, Floki, kind of like Floki from the show Vikings. But this guy was nicknamed Raven Floki because he used ravens in much the way they showed ravens being used to discover land in the early episodes of that show, which is, you go out to sea, you have ravens in cages, and every once in a while you let them go. If they come back, you're not near land. If they don't come back, you must be near land, because why would they come back to the ship when they can go to that land and, land in a tree or get away from the people that were keeping them in a cage? Like, they would obviously choose to go be free. But if they can't land anywhere else, well, they're not going to just dive into the sea and die. They'll go back to the ship where they fled from and hopefully get a better chance later. So this was a real method developed by this guy whose nickname was Raven Floki. That's how he found Iceland. He knew Iceland was there because someone else had found it first, and he was like, well, I want to find it. And this is what helped him rediscover it from the description given by the first people. So anyway, so that might have something to do with how some of this was done. George doesn't mention that, but it's a real idea that happened. It's kind of a natural idea that someone figured out. So it's entirely possible that someone amongst the Ironborn figured the same method out. They would have a very shallow population base, of course, not a large population in the first place. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a couple of push and pull here factors that would both lead towards maybe genetic issues, and then the other that would push against that, which is, well, yeah, such children would intermarry with each other, and this is a small population base, right? But on the other hand, as I said, salt wives, they capture people from far away and bring them against their will there. Now, obviously, this isn't a good thing. It's a terrible thing, but it does have the effect of reducing the odds of them having problems with interbreeding and borderline incest, if not actual incest. Things that they don't have a full concept of, the dangers of. It's a prohibition. They think it's gross, but the Farwynds are going to do things differently. They're going to do what they have to do. We can't have a diverse population base. We don't have room for that. And I don't know that they're particularly interested in it either, because they may not know how important it is. So it's a series of islands, all presumably paying homage to House Farwynd, and House Farwynd pays homage to the Greyjoys. So earlier I said they probably have a maester, but I don't know what about these other isles? They probably don't, because I don't think those are lords. If I'm wrong, though, boy, that's the most obscure place you can be sent as a maester. You must be very unpopular at the Citadel to get sent to Lonely Light. They're like, yeah, who do we really hate? That one guy? Let's send him to Lonely Light. That is the worst place to get sent. Like, you don't want to be a maester assigned to any Ironborn castle, but this one, ugh. Eesh, yeah, you don't want to go there. And because it's so far away and somewhat shunned and misunderstood, and people just don't want to think about it, that gives them a little more power over their own people. There's just no oversight from elsewhere. No one's paying attention to what they're doing. No one cares. That's the silver lining to them, for them, not for their small folk. It's the opposite for their small folk, because they could get away with doing things that they're not supposed to. They could break laws and go against traditions, and who's going to find out? Their small folk are going to go run to Pike and tell the Greyjoy? Well, he probably won't even care. And if he does, he won't care much. You know, like, what are they? It's just this fringe location so far away. He doesn't want to deal with that. Every Ironborn king has been focused east on attacking the mainland or conquering the mainland or getting glory and wealth from the mainland. They don't care about the Farwynds. They want some help from the Farwynds. They expect homage, but other than that, just leave them alone. And Farwynds can use that to their advantage. There's power in being left alone. There is an advantage to being ignored sometimes if you know how to capitalize on it. Now, Gilbert Farwynd maybe isn't that type. He seems dreamy and yeah, weird. And I often say weird meaning good, but I don't know about this case. He's just, yeah, just weird. Regular weird. But we shouldn't assume that all Farwynds are like that. His sons aren't necessarily like that just because they lose him. They are, just because they look like him, rather. They are Ironborn. Let's not lose sight of that. He didn't come off as like a very violent guy. In his speech, he seems like a dreamer, an explorer, a visionary. But these are raiders and pirates. Let's not mistake it, right? That's what they do. And in some ways, they might have to be more vicious than a lot of other raiders because they have a greater need. They don't have nearly as much provided to them by their own soil. They don't have industries. They don't have jewel smiths and artisans of all kinds. Art, yeah, there's not going to be much there, right? Poetry, higher-minded civilization things, maybe they don't even care about that, but you're definitely not going to find it at Lonely Light, right? Again, this is the extension of the Ironborn, who are generally not interested in that. And this is an extreme subset fringe of that. So they're definitely raiders and pirates, though. Obviously, they're trading and fishing and such also, all the other things you do with ships. But raiding and piracy, top of the list, partly by necessity, partly because they don't have a lot of other options, which I guess is kind of a similar point. In fact, I will make the case a few times throughout that it just matters to them more. It's a bigger part of their economy that they need to raid. Kind of like the free folk, right? The free folk steal things that they can't make or acquire on their own. Not that that makes it okay, but it's different than stealing just for personal gain. It's a different category. It's still stealing. It's still wrong, but it is, I would categorize it as different when you take things that you kind of need to live versus things that you just want, right? There would be a lot of scarcities at the Lonely Light. Like, they're not going to have all the things you would want, all the things you mainlanders would have day to day. And this is still, we're talking about a medieval setting where people don't have a lot of stuff. Lonely Light, we're talking scarce, scant, all the different adjectives, all the different similar words that describe that. Yeah. And this was all even more true before the unity among the Iron Isles, which isn't that long ago, historically speaking. Although, to be fair, the Farwynds don't go back to the beginning. The Farwynds, as we said, 1,000 years after Brandon the Burner. So they're not, we don't go all the way back to like early First Men times. This is post-Andal invasion era. So now there's also a religious prohibition against Ironborn fighting other Ironborn. If anyone's tempted to break that, it would be these guys, because, well, they could get away with it, or because they have more need. They could sail. What happens very often when the Ironborn raid the mainland? They smash and grab and get away, and people are like, we can't even follow them because they sailed off into the sunset, and we don't want to go we can't follow them. Like, they're too fast. Even if we wanted to follow them, we're going into hostile territory. The same kind of thing could happen with the Ironborn raiding other Ironborn. The Farwynds could raid, I don't know, Orkmont or something, or Pike even, and it would be very difficult for the people raided by the Farwynds to get back at them, you know? Like, you're going to go all the way to Lonely Light and steal their bronze? Like, you're going to steal back the food that they stole from you? I mean, yeah, like, what's the point? You might be mad, and you might want to go after them to make sure they don't do it again. But it's chintzy. right? You got to go a long way even to do that, and you might not win. So, yeah, they can get away with a lot. This is this point that I keep building on. It comes from a lot of different angles. They also might be left out of a lot of civil kind of conflicts. If the Ironborn take sides against each other, which has happened a few times, the Farwynds could just sit out. They don't be like, well, you guys go ahead and fight over it. We'll just hang back and not get involved. Or they could choose to be involved when they want and without being drawn in automatically. They can say, hey, let's take the side of the winning side. They're winning. Let's join them. Right? Let's send our 12 longships to join them or something. However huge amount of ships they have. Yeah. They would be among the most tested sailors, even though they're shunned, even though they're seen as strange. I mean, they got to sail 8 more days than even the farthest Ironborn just to get home and then back. That's 16 days of sailing there and back on top of whatever else. They just spend more time at sea. Just from sheer time on a ship, they would be the most experienced, if that's a bearing at all, if that's a basis at all. So the sheer amount of time, yeah, that's just, I think that would be valuable. That might be some rare thing that other Ironborn might reluctantly give them credit for. So now the iron price is a factor, right? They're not sailing all that way to buy things. That's not how the Ironborn work. Yeah, some of them do. Not all Ironborn are bound by the iron price concept. It's the more militant ones, the ones that the story tends to focus on. But we know there's other types of Ironborn that aren't all about that. It's the same way that real world perceives Vikings. The Vikings are the one that gets all the stories, the stuff talked about them. They're the exciting ones, but they made up a very small percentage of the Norse population at that time. There's plenty of just farmers and fishers and traders, just like there would be here. But the Lonely Light would be different in that regard because of the extreme isolation, the difference in culture as a subset and all that. The sunset is significant for them as well. It isn't just a symbol of who they are, a fact that they are the farthest west. It's the sunset, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. It's very germane to their whole iconic idea. Their whole basis, their sigil is very representative of who they are. But also, I think if you take the example, the concept of the Ironborn smash and grab, then fleeing back to their isles, they're fleeing into the sunset. It's not only dangerous to follow the Ironborn because they're good at sea. It's dangerous to fight them at sea, but they're experts at timing. Especially someone like Euron, we've seen that, like, they attack when the sun is just right to make it harder to see you coming and to make it harder for you to follow. They're sailing off into the sunset. They know where they're going. You don't. It's hard to follow in the first place, but even if you were going to try to follow, they're going to make it hard for you. They're sailing into the sunset. You know that in a little while it's going to be too dark to follow, and they're still going to know where they're going, basically, and you won't. So it's just kind of hopeless. She's like, they got us again. What can we do? Well, what they did over the long term was they just upped their defenses. Very, very long ago, it was much easier to raid because Westeros wasn't as built up. It wasn't as developed. The defenses weren't strong. But of course, that changed over time. More on that later. And as in general, too, the Ironborn like to hug the shore. We've seen that when Euron did something different and attacked out from open water, some of the Ironborn thought he was using magic. And we've been saying for years that, no, that wasn't magic. That was just good seamanship. That's just understanding how things work. That's completely mundane. It's just mundane in a way that a lot of Ironborn hadn't figured out. And so what they do is they hug the coast. This is something Victorian thinks about. This Lonely Light folks can't do that. They are 8 days away from the other Iron Islands, let alone the coast. So they would, by experience and by necessity, have less fear of and less ability on the open water. Better at navigating by stars, better at navigating by other factors. I don't think they had things like sextants for measuring. But they do have, whatever methods they have, they would have better than the rest of the Iron Islands. And the other Ironborn wouldn't want to admit that, but it's probably true. So we're told from those earlier quotes that the founder of Lonely Light, the guy who built that keep and that lighthouse, took the name Farwynd. So that makes him the founder. The sealskin point Farwynds came after, which is interesting. It's like, well, how did these obscure, distant dudes acquire land on Great Wyk? Yeah? Well, first let's examine the mundane options, which is a family dies out, and then they get it granted to them. You have a family completely dies out. Well, let's give it to another noble house or raise someone else in their place. Giving the northern west coast of Great Wyk to the Farwynds, that's not a problem in terms of empowering a house too much, because these aren't powerful lands, at least not that we know of. Sealskin Point doesn't sound very powerful. Sealskins, like, ooh, watch out for that. It sounds remote and isolated, though not as much as Lonely Light. So maybe that's why they got it, because, hey, they're experienced with that sort of thing. Or maybe they inherited it through the matriarchal line, right? There's a Farwynd whose ancestor was part of the family that just died out, so they're the one that inherited it. That kind of thing happens. Or they could have just earned it for great service. It could be like a Bear Island situation where the Mormonts not only got their island because of a Stark supposedly beating a Greyjoy in a wrestling match, or maybe it wasn't a Greyjoy, but an Ironborn king in a wrestling match, and then somehow the Mormonts got a Valyrian steel blade, 500 years prior to the start of the books. That has to be some sort of service they performed, because there's no way the Bear Islanders could afford a Valyrian steel blade. So that's a reasonable option here, that the Farwynds did something to earn it, in some bygone era. Because we don't know how long they've had Sealskin Point, but it probably wasn't too recent. But we do have some ideas. We'll get to that as we move our way through this episode. Let's now focus on Sealskin Point. They are the other branch of House Farwynd. Like I said, they're the northern coast of Great Wyk, almost the farthest west amongst the main island group. Great Wyk is basically an L, and the lower part of the L here would be where Pebbleton is, and this is up here where the Farwynds are, where Sealskin Point would be. So obviously they're not as isolated as Lonely Light, but except for Lonely Light, they might be the most next isolated. So the two branches of Farwynd might be the two most isolated branches of Ironborn there are. And of course, we're told this so-called scattered isles beyond Great Wyk. It's unclear whether the scattered isles beyond Great Wyk refer specifically to Lonely Light, or if there's other isles that are close to the west coast of Great Wyk, in addition to Lonely Light, which is northwest of Great Wyk. Hopefully all that made sense. There's either one set of extra islands that all surrounds Lonely Light, or two, with the other being off the coast of Great Wyk. I think it's the latter. I think there's a bunch of other isles here. And again, this is their specialty, right? Living on, managing, existing on unnumbered, unnamed isles. That's the Farwynd vibe, right? Now, as we've said, they're kind of poor, probably, if you go by what Gilbert Farwynd offered the other captains and kings at the Kingsmoot. They shunned it. The men of means, the greater captains, just turn their heads, turn their backs on what his offerings were. Still, this adds up. If you're two branches of House Farwynd, and each these little individual rocks that's subject to Lonely Light or Sealskin Point maybe doesn't have much power, but if we're talking like 20, 25 isles, and maybe 2/3 of those or a half have a household with a ship or two, that could add up to something significant. You might get up to 30, 40 longships. That's probably too high, and we're talking about centuries and centuries of history. Maybe at certain points their power has waxed and waned. Maybe they've gotten to that point in some era, and it wouldn't be surprising, if they could manage to get that strong. Great Wyk is the largest of the Iron Isles, so even though they're so remote, they are connected to the biggest of the isles. It's ruled mostly by House Goodbrother these days, and I say ruled by, I mean they're the most powerful house on Great Wyk, Hammerhorn being the most powerful castle there. They also the Goodbrothers have Corpse Lake, Crowspike Keep, and Downdelving, so they got 4 castles. House Merlin has Pebbleton, House Spar has Spar, I guess, and then there's the Farwynds. Now there's also Hor Castle, as in House Hor, Harwin Hardhand, all those guys, Harren the Black. It was destroyed well before Harren the Black and Harwin Hardhand, and it wasn't rebuilt. So one theory I have is that the destruction of Hoare Castle is related to the Farwynds acquiring land on Great Wyk. Maybe this was related. Maybe the Good brothers got the majority of the good territory that the Hoares gave up. But Sealskin Point might have been part of all that, and the Farwynds may have been able to grab it. Maybe because the Good brothers didn't care about it. They're like, yeah, you can have Sealskin Point. What do we care? Great Wyk is the richest of the Isles. That's important too, even though it is in terms of mineral wealth. Harlaw probably has the most actual money, and they're the closest to the mainland too, so they have more trade opportunity. But Great Wyk has lead, tin, and iron in great amounts. It also has timber in the mountains. Timber on the mainland used to be plentiful, but it's long since been cut down for longships. So maybe the Farwynds of Great Wyk are less strange than the Lonely Light ones, but maybe not. Maybe they're all just so connected to each other that they're all lumped in one group. So we're going to, as we continue, we'll come up with maybe a few more ideas of how the Farwynds got this land on Great Wyk, but probably it's related to this stuff with House Hoare, which we will go into more detail on in a little bit later. Kimber LaFay sends a super chat and says, was there an actual light of some kind that drew them there? Why did they stay if there are so little resources? Good question. Well, they weren't already nobles. The captain of the ship was not from some other noble house. Or if he was, it's not mentioned, and he would have been a second, third, fourth son. Someone that didn't have a land of his own. I think that's the basic simplicity of it. Yeah, it's poor land, but it's land. This is a captain who only had a ship. He didn't have any land of his own. And so he decided, well, I can continue to be a person with no land, or I can have this crappy land that it's far away, it's isolated, but it's land, and it can be mine. I think that's really it. And maybe some kind of actual light drew them there. It's possible. I definitely have some stuff in this episode coming up about stuff that might have already been there. Yeah, they found it, but that doesn't mean they were the first ones to find it. Someone else could have found it long ago. Someone could have found it and still been there. More likely someone found it and is long gone, but they might have left evidence of themselves. The Farwynds might not be too keen on sharing that. They might have found some valuable things they would rather keep to themselves, or stuff that the Maesters simply don't know about. Let's discuss the addressing the rumors, which in this case refers to things said about the Farwynds, in particular supernatural things said about the Farwynds. Aha, fun stuff, in other words. Now, a man that many consider mad weighs in on the supposed queerness of the Farwynds. Yeah, it's really one thing to be a madman calling other people mad, isn't it, Aeron Greyjoy? Quote,
Aeron knew some Farwynds, a queer folk who held lands on the westernmost shores of Great Wyk and the scattered isles beyond, rocks so small that most could support but a single household. Of those, the Lonely Light was the most distant, 8 days' sail to the northwest amongst rookeries of seals and sea lions and the boundless gray oceans. The Farwynds there were even queerer than the rest. Some said they were skinchangers, unholy creatures who could take on the forms of sea lions, walruses, even spotted whales, the wolves of the wild sea. It's like the chicken of the sea.
The chicken of the sea. The chickens of the wild sea. Yeah, the chickens of the wild sea have to run from the wolves of the wild sea. It's dangerous. People thinking island people are different and strange is nothing new. That happens in the real world all the time, and vice versa, too, to be honest. But this is island people thinking other island people are different and strange, so they must really seem strange to the mainlanders by the transitive property of strangeness, of course, which I know you're all very familiar with. So I wonder if it makes a problem for them in terms of marriages. I would think so, yes. In fact, very likely. They would probably have trouble finding brides from important houses, from other Ironborn noble houses. Brides in general, no, because again, they are landholders, they're noble, even if they're kind of at the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak. They wouldn't seem as strange to other people in their vicinity. Richer Ironborn who aren't nobles might be candidates here. Other Farwynd cousins might be candidates here. So all that would serve to make them even more insular, even more, incestuous in a way, if we're going that way. So I suspect that's a thing. But also, You just wouldn't see other houses clamoring for Farwynd brides. If we're looking in the other direction, it's one thing to bring brides there. It might be a little easier to send them away because, well, they're coming to you. That's always a little easier to accept. You're bringing a new woman in from some other house to live with you rather than sending your own daughter to live with someone else. That's you're usually, as the more powerful house, you get more say in the matter. And the Farwynds are rarely going to be the more powerful house. They're only going to be a more powerful house when it's them marrying into someone that isn't a house at all, like a non-noble situation. Nina adds that even more so than their skin-changing power, the marriage prospects would be limited just because of distance. Like, the sheer logistics of making the arrangements in the first place is a barrier, and there's just not much they could bring to the table in terms of power. Like, we aren't well-positioned to make money together, or we're not well positioned to, expand our trading opportunities, or to raid together. It's just, other houses would be able to offer more in that regard. So unless you have the very rare Ironborn lord that wants this, it's like, you know what, I want to bring this into my family. I want skin changing or this hidden knowledge or what have you. They actually want that, which is going to be pretty rare. But we're talking about a lot of history here. We're not talking 10,000 years, but we are talking several thousand years. So that's a lot of time for unusual things to happen, for rare things to happen. And that seems to be something that would maybe happen from time to time. Here's what the World of Ice and Fire has to say. It's another little tidbit for us to talk about. Quote,
"Queer things are said of the Farwynds and the small folk they rule. Some say they lie with seals to bring forth half-human children, whilst others whisper that they are skinchangers who can take the forms of sea lions, walrus, even spotted whales, the wolves of the Western Sea." Sorry.
There we are again.
Strange tales like this are common at the edges. Strange tales like this are fuck. I'm so sorry. It's been so long. Okay. Okay. I'm so sorry. I just keep thinking about George loving the turn of phrase "wolves of the Western Seas" and like using it again. Whew. Sorry, Aziz. You might have to read this whole quote. Hold on. Okay, I got it. Strange tales like this are common. Just start over and read it for me. I got only one sentence. It's been like 6 months. Oh.
Queer things are said of the Farwynds and the small folk they rule. Some say they lie with seals to bring forth half-human children, whilst others whisper that they are skin changers who can take the forms of sea lions, walrus, even spotted whales, the wolves of the Western Seas. Strange tales like this are common at the edges of the world, however, and the Lonely Light stands farthest west of all the lands known to us. It sounds familiar to what's said about the free folk, but with seals instead of the others. Remember what Old Dan says, the free folk, or he calls them the wildlings would lie with the others to sire half-human children. Yeah, it's the same concept, which is being referred to. Strange tales like this are common at the edge of the world. Yeah, this is a different edge of the world. It's the west instead of the north, but it's a similar concept, right? The same concept here with lying with seals to bring forth half-human children, too. That's, again, we're coming back to selkies. And they're called that in Fire and Blood on the section on Alyssa Farman, right there. And that's used as an example. Now, this says nothing about the selkies rumors, but in general, whether they're true or not. But both branches of Farwynd live amongst quite a few seals. According to Fire and Blood, the ratio of seals to humans around there is 50-1. So they definitely live amongst the seal. That doesn't mean that's not a reason to believe they necessarily skin change with them. But if they do skin change, and I'm very open to the idea, that those are the animals that are there. They're not going to be bonding with some wolf on the mainland, hundreds of miles away. They're going to be bonding with whatever animals are there. That's who they bond with. And it's mentioned twice, and we know what we say about something mentioned twice by George. If it's a tidbit of lore and it comes up more than once, then it's more likely to be true or more likely something George wants us to notice and think about or imagine. This one's already pretty fun to think about, but it's also got this backing, the twice mentioned backing. Think about the extreme potential here for skin changing. This gets pretty fun, even if it's a little tinfoily. It's got to be possible. Sharks, whales, kraken. Can you imagine a skin changer using a kraken? Right? Like, could Bran do that? Like, I think he could if he really wanted to. I doubt the story takes us to that. But if he can go into any animal, why not a kraken? And if you could do that, if you could skin change into any deep sea creature, whether it's a big one or a small one, it would give you literal eyes into the depths. Like, if there's merlings, if there's deep ones, if there's other mysteries, if there's shipwrecks or the drowned god's watery halls, for God's sake, the god being the drowned god in this case, or the storm god, you might go looking for that, right? If you're a Ironborn believer, you believe in the drowned god, you're faithful, you're devout, you're pious, but you also have skin changer powers. Well, first of all, you would probably thank the drowned god for the skin changer powers. You wouldn't also thank the old gods. And you would probably attribute it to the drowned god like everything else in your religion. And if you could see under the sea, if you could see down there, then yeah, that's what you want. You want to see that. It's really... I just feel like that would happen, you know? You're a zealous Farwynd skin changer. Look for the drowned god's watery halls. You might think that's why you were given that power. That's why the drowned god gave you this, so that you could be the one to reveal it. You could be the one to see it. Like, hey, maybe the drowned god has made me a prophet of types. And there's got to be some priests of the drowned god that live on Lonely Light or that were born there. They can't all come from Old Wyk or Great Wyk or the other places. The priests are born where they're born. Devout men are born where they're born. Zealous people are born where they're born. There's nothing saying that they can't be born on Lonely Light or Sealskin Point. In fact, they might be more likely to, because it's such a barren location. You know, there's like less other aspects of civilization to be distracted by. It's just the basics. It's the sea, the religion of the drowned god, and living and dying. You know, what else is there when you're that far west? You know, life is simpler. Now, wolves of the Western Seas, this phrase comes up again a couple of times. That's meaningful, maybe. Like, it's used in the context of skin changing. Wolves. Like, that's the number one animal in the north that skin changing happens with. Those are wargs. They're the one type of skin changer that has their own sub-name. Warg's only a wolf skin changer. There aren't, nicknames for bird skin changers or boar skin changers or any of the other animals. It's only wargs that have their own special name for it. So Nina suggests this is intentional by George to make a subconscious connection between skin changer concepts. Wolves are the most important skin-changing animal, the most common. And so we get this mention of both the Ironborn are referred to as wolves of the Western Seas and these basically killer whales. Spotted whales are probably orcas. They're not called orcas, but they're basically the Westeros or the Planetos equivalent of killer whales, which, by the way, would be a wicked fun thing to imagine as a thing to skin change into, a killer whale amidst a pod of others. Like, take over the leader of that pod, have a whole army of killer whales behind you. What kind of power would that make you feel like you have if you're a person doing that? So that's I think that's a good catch by Nina, identifying the language George uses spanning across both these Ironborn concepts and attaching it to this northern concept, which is skin changing is a very northern thing. But here it's kind of an exception. Why do we have this? Where else are skin changers talked about? Nowhere, pretty much. There's ancient tales of skin changers at places like Red Lake and maybe elsewhere in Westeros from way long gone times. But now it's purely a thing of the north. You know, maybe the occasional Blackwood or something like that. We don't actually have evidence of that. We just suspect it. So, yeah, like that's a big deal, right? It's very notable. And actually, Nina points out here that the enhanced edition of A Feast for Crows explicitly identifies spotted whales as orcas. So that's not just a guess. That's revealed as truth. Now, orcas can swim really far. Real life killer whales, they can go really, really far. They can go the span of a continent in like 10 days. So if a person can skin change into an orca, they could really explore far, really far west without any danger of shipwreck or anything like that. So when Gilbert Farwynd talks about exploring the far west, he says he's like had these visions. Are they dreams? Are they skin changing visions? He's seen them through the eyes of a sea creature, potentially a spotted whale. It's a compelling idea. But yeah, there's no skin changers elsewhere. Even if we just focus on the Ironborn, there is not even a hint that I can recall of skin changing on any other island or any other Ironborn house. So this is a real exception, and that makes it meaningful and curious and fun. Could it be something on the island itself? Could it be some sort of northern connection or something there, something they found? I wouldn't go so far as to guess that there's a weirwood tree there, because that would be mentioned. I think the maesters would point that out. That wouldn't be kept hidden. And why would they keep it hidden? They'd be like, yeah, there's a weirwood here. What's the big deal? If maybe there was one long ago that they got cut down or something. Anyway, something else, maybe some sort of relic or left behind evidence of another civilization. Who knows? Maybe there were already small folk there. Maybe there were some leftover small folk. Nina has a great idea here. If there weren't people there from long ago, like thousands of years back, maybe even something that came from the far west, there could have been shipwrecks or castaways or maroons or even colonists from Brandon the Shipwright's fleet. They went west to explore and they never came back. It doesn't mean they didn't find this on the way. They could have found it and they would have reported it had they ever made it back to Westeros. But since they didn't, whatever knowledge they had disappeared with them. But it's entirely possible that some people were like, hey, lonely, this is a new place. Let's live here. It didn't go very well. It's a crappy colony. They didn't raise a lighthouse because that came from the Farwynds. But if you look at the history of people in the real world trying to make bad land work, there's a lot of it. And a lot of it comes from the people who are most related to the Ironborn, the Norse, the Scandinavians, the Vikings, whatever name you want to assign to them. There is no perfect catch-all phrase for that. Like many Viking peoples tried to settle in places like Greenland and a lot of these other islands that are just without the magical element, though they probably believed in some magical elements. They believe in supernatural things. So it certainly guided their decisions, even if it wasn't literally impacting them from that aspect. But there were just a lot of attempts to find new places to live, even if the land is bad. The Norse were pretty stubborn as far as settling goes. They would, once they committed to living somewhere, they would really see it through. There's a lot of examples of failed Norse settlements, and not only in the sagas, but from archaeology, finding them. And it's not just the Norse that do that, but they're a particular example, not just because they're the most similar we have to the Ironborn, but because their methods would be similar, because they're sailing and finding islands, and because they have this similar stubbornness about, well, land is land, y'all. There is not an unlimited amount of it, and who knows when we'll find more uninhabited land. If you're living in the 9th century, you might be thinking there isn't a whole lot of good land left in the world to claim. Whether that's true or not is a matter of perspective. But you can see why, where they're born, you're born on mainland Scandinavia, you're born in Norway or Denmark or Sweden, you're like, well, all the stuff here's taken. So finding new islands is very compelling. Even if those islands are crappy, at least you're living free. At least no one's telling you what to do. And that matters a lot. So it's definitely tempting to think people were there already. That Nina's idea, I really like that. Now, another idea is frequent raiding in the north. What if the Farwynds just attacked the Stony Shore a lot and captured a lot of northern people? I like bringing this idea up, but I don't think it takes us anywhere because, well, this other Ironborn houses do that too, and then they don't have skin changing. So that probably doesn't make it work. That probably doesn't answer the question. Also, George just said that he's pushed back on skin changing being a genetic thing anyway. Like all the Starks have it. All this current Stark generation have it. That doesn't argue for genetics. That argues for some other sort of magic going on. Now, he doesn't say it's not genetic. He just doesn't want to define it that way. So there might be some genetic element to it, as Nina says, but it's just not a guaranteed trait. It's just something it's a fringy, rare thing that pops up. It may have something to do with genetics, may have something to do with other things other supernatural forces that we can't pinpoint. But the genetic tendency, if there is a little bit of a genetic tendency, well, this is a very isolated inbred population. So if it is a little bit of a genetic component to it, that genetic component would be maintained more likely than it would somewhere else because of the closeness to inbreeding, if not actual inbreeding. Now, what about the value of skin changing when doing the thing we said the Farwynds would have to rely on, which is reaving? Having a skin changer in your midst, honestly, I think that would be more useful for straight up piracy than raiding the mainland because, well, if you've got a whale or just some smaller, like a fish that you're using to skin change into, you could find other ships. And if it's a larger animal, you could even like inhibit it. Like a gray whale or sperm whale or killer whale could actually do severe damage to another ship, and then you could come up and loot it or something like that. So not just the scouting, but the actual attacking of the ship. What's a whale going to do for you if you're attacking some village, 1 mile offshore? Maybe nothing. Whales couldn't even get that close. They risk getting beached or what have you. Now, if you're a skin changer that can use multiple animals, like a Varamir or someone really powerful like Bran, then that's not a barrier either. Use a whale to get close to shore, then just skin change into some bird that's on land and spy on this village you're about to attack and be like, yeah, they don't see us coming. Now is the right time to attack. Very valuable. A skin changer in a raiding party, both at sea and on land, if they have sufficient power, they'd be invaluable. Very invaluable. Navigation, scouting, all these things. Finding the right moment to attack, which they rely on, right? The Ironborn aren't big on frontal assaults. They'll do it. They don't back down easily. I just got through saying how stubborn they are, but they prefer to start fights that are easy for them to win. They are very much bullies in that regard. And skin changing could be valuable for just surviving, right? This is an isolated environment, right? Can the Farwynds, let's say, again, using the orca or large animal example, large sea creature, can you drive a school of fish towards a fishing boat or a fishing fleet? Yeah, maybe. Things like that. Drive seals close to shore for getting speared. Yeah, why not? It's an interesting thing to think about, skin changing being used for such mundane activities, but these folks might be on the fringes of survival. And whether it's used to chase ships, or rather chase seals or fish, or to ram ships that are carrying loot. I think all these things are in the realm of possibility without stretching very much at all, or literally at all. It is a little weird and a little bit spooky, if not creepy, to imagine how does this bond develop in the first place, right? Like, often it comes with proximity, right? The direwolves bonding with the Starks had a lot to do with day-to-day contact and them having a fondness for their animals and really bonding with them. How does that happen with a fish or a shark or something like that? You're like, I feel the call of the sea. You got Aaron walking out into the surf and feeling the call of the drowned god. Maybe something like that. But you're still not like necessarily getting a lot of physical contact with this creature, probably. Maybe some, though. But it's creepy, right? Thinking about that, like the call of the ocean. You have this connection to some sea creature. Yeah, that's kind of creepy. A voice from the depths that might be interpreted by some Ironborn as the call of the drowned god himself. Even if no one else would see it that way, a devout or even semi-devout Ironborn person might think that way. Easy to think of it that way. Yes, this could all be rumor, the Maesters suggest that it's just, well, people say weird things about people who live on the fringes. And, well, these are some very fringy living people. So the stories about them would, by definition, be amongst the most wild, the most fantastical, the most rumor-mongery. But that doesn't mean it's not true. Strange tales are not always just tales. Strange things happen in our world, and this is a supernatural world we're talking about. So the Maesters are wrong way too often for us to just say, yeah, the Maesters are probably right. Let's just toss this out. It's also just way too fun to toss out, right? It's way more fun to imagine some truth or a lot of truth to it than just to call it all rumor. I don't even think George would want to do it that way. Guilty Undertaker asks, orcas are sometimes called the wolves of the sea in our own world. Oh, I didn't know that. That's cool. They do hunt in packs. That makes a lot of sense. Kimber LaFay says Wolves of the Western Sea is going to be my new band name. Nice. That's a good one. What kind of genre? It sounds like a metal band, right? There is a band called Wolves in the Throne Room, which already sounds kind of Game of Thrones. That's a black metal band, so I don't actually recommend them unless you're really into that sort of thing, which I'm not. I like metal, but not black metal. Anyway, y'all, appreciate the comments. If you are thinking of supporting us, it's a great time to do it. This time of year is less going on, We're digging deep into our topics. We're doing our thing. We're doing what we always do. But the fandom has its ebbs and its flows, There's times when it's a lot more active. There's times where it's a little less active. We're getting back into a time when it's going to get active again, more active than it ever is, because we've got 2 TV shows coming in 2026. But this year, yeah, it's a little less than it's been. So this is a time for us to rely on y'all even more than we normally do, because, well, we ebb and flow with the fandom. When there's more interest, we do better. When there's less, we don't. But we're doing it no matter what. This is what we do. So we weather all the storms and reap the whirlwind when it comes. But no matter what we're faced with, it's all coming from you all. Yes, we have some sponsors here and there, but they aren't the biggest part of this. You all provide us with much more support in total than we get from these platforms, which is, in some ways, that's disappointing. Big platforms, why don't you do better? But in another way, it makes us very grateful that you all are doing more for us than YouTube and Spotify, these giant companies with all that money. Well, that's the way it is. That's the truth, y'all. So we really appreciate your support. If you want to join us on Patreon and become a supporter and getting access to bonus episodes, voting on episodes like this was, in fact, the first episode of Mini Moot 2025. At the beginning of each year, we do Topics Moot, which is a series of votes to come up with episodes. Because Dunk and Egg was moved to next year, we had some time set aside for it that we no longer needed for that. So we did this, the Mini Moot. 6 topics were chosen. This is the first one. And most of the rest of 2025 will be covering those other topics. So yeah, if you want to join us, go to patreon.com, pick the membership level that's right for you, and join in the community. We also have things like access to our scripts and notes, and a few other things that are described there at patreon.com/History of Westeros. Our next section, Visions of the Sunset Lands. This is what Lord Gilbert actually says during the King's Moot. Quote,
Lord Gilbert began to speak. He told of a wondrous land beyond the sunset sea, a land without winter or want, where death had no dominion.
Name me your king. Make me your king, and I shall lead you there,
he cried.
We will build 10,000 ships as Nymeria once did, and take sail with all our people to the land beyond the sunset. There, every man shall be a king, and every wife a queen. That's wild. Like, what the heck is this guy talking about? Sure, we've heard tales of the West, and there are some, maybe Alyssa Farman found it, maybe she circumnavigated the globe, maybe somebody else did. But this actually Lord Gilbert's speech was published somewhere around 2002 or 2003, long before Fire and Blood, long before The World of Ice and Fire, like well over a decade before either, like 15, 16 years before Fire and Blood. And that's because George published most of the Ironborn chapters in A Feast for Crows in something called Arms of the Kraken. Some of you all remember that. It was published in Dragon magazine.
Oh, we should have grabbed your copy.
Yeah, I do have a copy over here, and I did go to a Barnes and Noble the day that was published, took an extra long lunch break from my job, read it twice. And Lord Gilbert, yeah, he was in there. This quote was in there. So 2002-ish, we've had it that long. The Farwynds have been around, have been described that long. Of course, they were in the Storm of Swords appendix in 2001, but this is when they actually appear. And this is when George starts developing this idea of lands beyond the sunset sea. This wasn't spoken of very often. Alyssa Farman had never been mentioned. Brandon the Shipwright had. But that's about it, right? George had barely scratched the surface with this. And this is a very early entry into that journal of concepts about what's to the west. The Ironborn weren't all even that well defined at this point. Remember, the Ironborn storyline didn't really start till A Feast for Crows. It was basically just a little bit of Theon. Theon went there, and he was our eyes into what was going on there. But then Theon goes back to Westeros pretty quickly to attack Winterfell and do the Stony Shore and all that. So it made sense in a way for George to expand that. He expanded it a lot. He went really deep with the Ironborn, and for better or worse, we have a lot more Ironborn than we may have predicted back in the day. And we didn't have Victaria or Asha chapters until this, let alone the Forsaken. Sorry, Arya. Asha, I mean, obviously. Arya. We definitely had Arya chapters.
No, I think you said Victaria or Asha.
Did I Victaria? I said Victaria. That's funny.
Victaria.
Victarian. Yeah, Victaria. That would be what she was called if she had been female. So very... I want to impress on you how new this was when it was first released and how far ahead of some of the other related concepts it was. His sons are named in the appendix. They aren't named in the actual chapter. They're Giles, Egon, and Jon. Egon is Y-G-O-N, and Jon is like Bronze Jon Royce. Do they agree with him? Are they like, yeah, lands to the west? Or are they like, man, Dad just will not shut up about that weird-ass lands to the west stuff. Like, he is nuts. Maybe they share it, though. Maybe they're like, yeah, we saw that vision, too. We believe him. He's our father, and we trust him. Yeah, we have no idea. I sort of lean towards the latter. I mean, they're brought up in the same isolated culture, too, and they look like him. They shave like him. They seem to be his champions, so they're probably following his beliefs as well. Now, there was an Alton Greyjoy who wanted to sail to the west as well. He was Lord Reaper of Pike maybe 80 years before the books, but that's a guess. His nickname was the Holy Fool, so he was very devout, but obviously to the Drowned God, and for some reason that made him think there were lands to the west. So Quelon, Balon, Euron, these are his descendants, right? These guys are related to the Holy Fool. Nina even suggests Alton maybe married a Farwynd. That's a good theory. He would have maybe inherited their beliefs or their ideals, their visionary concepts of what's to the west, and he may have been bought into that whole vision. Maybe even he married a Farwynd, and that's why he got so close to them. Now, I wouldn't guess that the firstborn son of the Greyjoy, the Lord Reaper of Pike, would marry such a smaller house like the Farwynds, but maybe Alton was a second or third son who ended up inheriting due to some deaths in front of him. And so you ended up with a Farwynd at the top anyway, though it wasn't the intent. It's interesting to consider that this is where Euron's supernatural angles come from, if this passed down to him some way, whether genetically or some other connection. His dreams of flying, right? There's a lot of theories around Euron and him being like a failed green seer, an experiment, or maybe Bloodraven and his children, friends, thought that maybe he was the last green seer, the one that Bran turned out to be. When they were looking for Bran, well, Euron came along first, and they entertained the idea that it was him before realizing, oh, this guy is evil. It's not him. At least we hope it's not him. So there's a lot of overlap there, a lot of similar magical speak. And it's tempting to connect Euron, given his unusual magical, shall we say, connections. Even if none of that is inborn, maybe it's all just things he's acquired through artifacts and research and going to weird places. But if any of that's in him, if he has like some magical bloodline or something like that, something taught to him by a cousin or a distant kin, well, the Farwynds are at the top of the list for that candidacy, for being that source for Euron. Whether it's internal, whether it's bloodline related, or whether it's passing information to him, there definitely could be something there. So if we're being clear, there are definitely lands to the west. There's no doubt, unless the planet isn't a globe, then maybe you'll just fall off the edge then maybe not. But I'm pretty sure we can call it a globe. So the question is just how far west? How far is it to Ashai? Is it insanely far? Is it less far than we think? I mean, the Ironborn don't have great long sailing vessels. They esteem the mariner. They are proud of and respect people that are explorers. But their ships aren't great at it. Long ships are not good exploring ships. They are raiding ships. They're decent for trading and for going places that are hard to reach. They can go upriver. That makes it really useful both for attacking and for trade. but it does not make it useful for going into the open ocean, especially for vast distances. In fact, it's quite bad for that. It's capable, but not good. Not good for that. Not for the kind of distance we're likely talking about. Definitely Viking longships went from, Norway to England. You're going over some pretty choppy seas there. That's the North Sea. That can be pretty dangerous. Quite far. But I think we're talking about a much larger distance here. Plus, they don't know where they're going. The Norse people knew where England was. There was trading there long before there was raiding there. So it was kind of a known commodity, where this is not. No one, if there's a known route, it's by no means public, at least on this side of the ocean. Maybe the people over there know it, but if so, then why aren't they ever seen? I guess they're like, yeah, we don't want to go over there. We know the route. It's too dangerous and worthless. You just end up facing the Ironborn now. That wouldn't be true. You could face Old Town that way. But apparently it's just not a thing. It's too far. But if we're casting our memory long, long ago, the idea is different. If there were people to the west who came east to settle or explore or to establish trading outposts, that's very believable. Something like a transatlantic trade operation long, long gone. Spain had a very long period where they did this. They looted the heck out of the New World, grabbing gold and silver from the natives who cared very little about it, though they cared quite a lot about what the Spanish were doing to them in the process of taking all that loot, and sending it back to Europe to fight wars, usually against England, but against other people, and to just be wealthy. So why would that be possible then and not now? Well, we're talking a long time before. There may have been a great empire of the dawn back then, or back even farther, and there may have been something before them even. But let's just stick with the idea of the Great Empire of the Dawn, because they're a little more tangible. If they're responsible for the oily black stone, well, there's oily black stone on Pike. There's oily black stone at Old Town, at the base of the High Tower. So there is some evidence that people from Far East made it to the West, not to live maybe, but to trade. Maybe to live, but to trade for sure. That would be a lot more likely. And why, though? What would you trade with in Westeros in this era? There's nothing. There isn't evidence of a lot of civilization in Westeros in this era. Elsewhere, yes. Essos and beyond, sure. Not Westeros, though. This is the era of children and giants, and that's it. Untamed. The humans on Westeros at this point would have just been on the fringes, on the outsides of the continent, like where Old Town is, for example. So what would they be coming to trade for? Magic. They'd be coming to trade for that kind of technology. They're not trading for metals and things like that, gemstones, well, because that's not being produced at Westeros in this era. Maybe obsidian, maybe they have a use for that. Maybe some other things like amber, but for the most part, it would be magical knowledge going back and forth, if anything, because I don't know what else they'd be interested in. And that is suggested. This isn't just my idea. The World of Ice and Fire suggests this sort of thing. Not connected to the Farwynds, not even necessarily connected to the Great Empire of the Dawn, but connected to something that's long gone, which might be the Great Empire of the Dawn. It might be something that predates them even. But if there's a little bit of oily black stone on Pike, and there's some at the High Tower, there might be smaller amounts that have gone undetected elsewhere. Maybe there's some on the Lonely Light in that territory, maybe just a tiny bit. Something that too small to have captured the notice of the maesters. And most of the maesters don't care about it anyway. It'd be there. Maybe it's very telling. So someone like us would be like, wow, the oily black stone is on Lonely Light. That's huge. Hardly anyone else would care about that. Not in world. So, yeah. And now the idea of transatlantic trade, also you would need the idea of, well, maybe they just had better magic. And that's how they could navigate that far. Or maybe they just had better ships. Right? We just got to talk about how longships are not particularly well equipped for this. Alyssa Farman, she made one of the best ships ever seen. She did all sorts of research and used all her experience to make an incredible ship, the likes of which has not been seen since. So that goes to show that's we're not talking about cutting edge technology that Westeros has for sailing, but this long gone race might have gotten to that point either through mundane technology, through magic, or through both. And again, it's not far-fetched because on the real world, you've got places that people have been living unchecked for thousands of years. Some places are just that well made. They turned out that well in terms of habitation for humans. or our ancient cousins like Neanderthal and Denisovans. For example, there's a place called Diyarbakir. I probably said that wrong. It's in what was Mesopotamia, now part of Turkey. People have been living in that area uninterrupted since 8,000 BC for 10,000 years. That's a massive scale of time, but when we're talking about Westeros and Essos, the scale seems to be a little larger. The scale seems to be what we're faced with on Planetos is something like, well, the scale of human civilization is bigger. Humans have been building cities for longer on Planetos than they have on Earth. So extrapolate that. If they've been doing it longer than on Earth, and we have people that have been living in the same place for 10,000 years on Earth, well, how long have people been living in the West? How long have people lived where Ashai was? How long have people lived in ET? More than 10,000 years, most likely. One of the, just as one other example, Argos, that came up a few times in our Greece episodes. Argos, people have been living in Argos, in that region, in that little area where that city is, since 5,000 BC. So that's another like 7,000 years. So yeah, this isn't, there aren't few examples. There's a lot of examples like this. Not that many that go back 7 or 10,000 years. There's a lot more that are 5, 6, 3, whatever. But there's thousands of year examples all over the place. What knowledge was passed down? It might not be an object or something like a heart tree or some oily black stone that the Farwynds found. They could just have knowledge passed down from their forebears. One particularly powerful skin changer among the Farwynds could have discovered an awful lot by themselves, and that could be passed down through the years to future Farwynds. It might not be something they want to spread knowledge of. They wouldn't necessarily want to share that secret with other people. It makes them seem even weirder. It makes them even more isolated. It makes people shun them even more. Why talk about all this magical stuff that no one's even going to believe them on? Keep it to yourselves. I mean, what do other Ironborn think if they really are skin changers? Wouldn't that make them think, yeah, that's just not part of their world, right? Ironborn aren't skin changers, except maybe these guys. So that, yeah, what a huge thing to keep them separate from the rest of the Ironborn. It also, just think about it from a cynical point of view, or maybe it's not even cynical. You have crappy lands. Yeah, we said it's land. Any land is better than no land, but if you're the Farwynds, you might be like, yeah, I'll take any opportunity to find something better than this. Maybe that means we got to go all the way west. If anyone's more likely to want to believe in stuff to the west, it's the people that have the most vested interest in, climbing the ladder to better lands. They're among they are landholders, but they are among the poorest landholders amongst noble houses, and certainly the farthest separated from the rest. So this dream Gilbert Farwynd has, it's like, yeah, well, his people would benefit among the most. Like, well, everybody's going to be a king or a queen. That's a bigger jump for them than for a lot of other folks. And if we're talking about this standard telephone game, the rumor mill, well, if this supposed Farwynd skin changer who lived 1,000 years ago and learned all this information by skin changing into animals beneath the sea, seeing things, going to the far west, all these things that he told his family that they've passed down, how many generations of telephone game has this gone down through? The tales would grow over time. They wouldn't be under exaggerated. They wouldn't get, the story wouldn't get weaker over time. It would get more fanciful, more exaggerated, more outlandish. But there may be a shred of truth to it. There may be a core truth within all that, as there often is with these myths, these legends. Here's a description, another bit of description for Gilbert Farwynd that I think is worth talking about. Quote,
"His eyes, Aaron saw, were now gray, now blue, as changeable as the seas. Mad eyes, he thought, fool's eyes. The vision he spoke of was doubtless a snare set by the storm god to lure the Ironborn to destruction."
Speaking of a kernel of truth within something that's a little crazy, because, well, I doubt it was a snare set by the storm god, but the sailing west could definitely be disastrous. It could lose the entire fleet that way, especially given what I said about the capability of some of the Ironborn ships. Now, the Ironborn do have larger ships, especially after with Balon's efforts, but they were still larger ships meant for war. They weren't built for long voyages. So they're still not particularly well equipped for it. But yeah, so he could be half right about that the vision is a bad idea because it could get them killed. It would be very dangerous. But yeah, this whole storm god business, I don't know about that. I don't know about his eyes either. This is curious. I want to think there's something going on with this guy's eyes other than just, sunlight changing the angle of where he's looking and it makes it look differently. It's not linked to any other magic we've seen. Like, who has changing eyes like this? I can't think of anyone that really fits like this. So it doesn't neatly fit into another magical discipline or magical area. As changeable as the seas, he says, Aeron does. Well, Aeron, if it's changeable as the seas, then that's not the storm god, that's the drowned god. If it was this changeable as the skies or the clouds, then you're dealing with the storm god. See, he's contradicting himself. But like I said, Aeron is crazy too. This is a madman interpreting the actions of a matter man. Maybe Aeron is the matter of the two. I don't know. He doesn't sound like a skin changer, this guy. Not that we've only got the one Farwynd talking here, so we can't extrapolate everything about the family just from this one guy. He sounds more like a visionary, a prophet, a dreamer, or a legit madman, or some combination of the above. He doesn't come off like a skin changer, even with the eyes changing color. That's not something we associate with skin changing. Like, the show did stuff with the eyes, with changing color and them going all white. And even that isn't the same as this, going from gray to blue. Yeah, that's not really like the skin changer eyes going white on the TV show. That's a different thing entirely. So, yeah. So Aeron is crazy, and this guy seems crazy to him. Aeron thinks some pretty sane things are crazy, to be honest, like, shoes and drinking regular water or washing your hair. Like, he thinks all those things are crazy. But I'll still go with him on this. I still think that Gilbert is also a madman of sorts, or just maybe, for lack of a better term, he's a little off at best, something like that. John Merkel sends a super chat and says, "You said my super chat point while I was typing it. So now I'll just say y'all rock, and thanks for leading us deeper into the Song of Ice and Fire mines." The mines, that's a good way to put it. This one feels more like depths because it's so, nautical themed, but the mines, that's a good metaphor. And we are mining for nuggets of fun here. Deep into the mine, the George R. Martin mines, the Gur mines. Yeah. But there's a lot of good stuff down here, isn't there? So, yeah, we got to go deep, but it pays off. Thanks, John. Real remote islands discovered by chance or wind. A brief history of the real world, especially of Norse explorers. If we're going all over the place, there's plenty of other explorers that we could talk about. But we'll limit ourselves to Scandinavians for this exercise to keep the topic manageable. Iceland. Starting with Iceland. Though most likely discovered by Irish priests, they didn't really write it down. The first Viking to find it was a guy named Nadod. I don't know how to say that, but wow. His name is 7 letters, and 4 of them are D's. It's Naddodd. That's a lot of D, man. He was trying to go to the Faroe Islands, which are north of England. Those had already been settled in this era, which was 861 AD. Just for reference, 861 AD is 10 years before Alfred the Great became king. Around this era, Harold Fairhair was forging Norway into one kingdom. That's supposedly dated 872, so 11 years after this. There's a lot of issues with the historicity of Harold Fairhair, so that date might be wrong. Either way, it's around this era. Charles the Bald was king of France. He's the grandson of Charlemagne. This was around the time that France split into two. Western Francia ended up becoming France. Eastern Francia became the Holy Roman Empire, and then Germany. So this Nadod guy found it, and he went back and told people about it. And he was blown off course, right? Iceland is really far from the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands are closer to England than Iceland by a lot. So when someone can be blown off course, when you hear the story or hear that phrase, blown off course, the real world supports blown off course occasionally being really far. Ironically, it's called Iceland now. This first guy, Ned Dodd, called it Snowland, so his name didn't stick, but something very similar did. This guy was actually related to Eric the Red and Leif Erikson. Well, Eric the Red was the father of Leif Erikson, so if you're related to one, you're related to both. So not long after Ned Dodd found this place, people went looking for it. They're like, oh, really? There's another island up there. Let's go find it. The first one to go there on purpose, meaning the first guy after the discovery by accident via Ned Dodd, this guy, the first one to go after, was that Raven Floki guy that I mentioned earlier, the guy who used the Raven method to find land when he was exploring. He stayed there over winter, which must have been tough. The winters in Iceland are bad. But he survived, and his people survived, at least most of them. And when the winter was over, he was shocked at how green Iceland became and was like, whoa, this place is... During the winter, he must have thought, oh, what a horrible mistake we've made. Why did we come here? But then when the winter was over, he's like, actually, this place is livable after all. With 3 seasons of preparing, we could get through that winter if we had enough time to, get ready for it. They don't need to get fancy with the terminology there. Just prepare for that horrible winter and you'll be fine. Be fine, relatively speaking. Now, many people moved to Iceland after this guy found it. This other guy, Gardar Svarvarsson, that's really hard to say. He was the second Viking guy to go there on purpose. Although they didn't stay there permanently that we know of. A lot of these guys were, they were trying to escape the burgeoning kingship of Harald Fairhair. Iceland was a place very dedicated to keeping people independent. This guy named Ingolfur Arnarsson. Yeah, the word arson and golfer are in this guy's name. Ingolfur Arnarsson and his wife Halveig Frodisdottir were the first permanent settlers there in a place they called Smoke Cove. That's cool, right? Smoke Cove. The other name for Smoke Cove in Icelandic is Reykjavik. Yay, the capital, right? So that's cool. The first settled place is the current capital. That's pretty amazing. There is some evidence that the Gardar Svarvarsson, some of his people actually stayed behind and lived there first, but whatever. We're not trying to take anything away from Gardar Svarvarsson's men, even though we don't know their name. The reason we don't know this for sure is because almost everything written about Iceland in the early days was written centuries later. But archaeological evidence does confirm that there was a settlement in 870. So that absolutely lines up with this story. However, there are more finds. There's actually a longhouse found that apparently carbon dating or whatever dating process they're using dates it to about 800 AD, so several decades, 70 years prior to these other instances. So there may be the history on Iceland may be off. There may have been Vikings that came there even sooner. And certainly there were, as I said, Irish priests that found there. If y'all remember the show Vikings, this is the second time I brought it up, Floki, not Raven Floki, but the character Floki in the show goes to Iceland and just thinks it's Asgard. He thinks he's found Asgard, the home of the Norse gods. And a nod to this the historicity of Irish priests finding it first and just going there to be hermits because it's empty. And talk about a place to be a hermit. There's nobody there. So in the show, Floki lives there for a while, thinks it's, like I said, thinks it's Asgard, thinks he's in the home of the gods. One day he goes into a cave and he finds a cup and a Christian cross, and he freaks out so hard. He's like, what the hell is a Christian cross doing in Asgard? Well, the answer is it's not Asgard. But that just goes to show, even though that show wasn't very historically accurate, that's a pretty cool way to show what might have happened. Some Viking explorer, some Scandinavian might have found a Christian cross lying there. That's not unrealistic at all, right? Because they did live there before the Vikings. So, Now, some guy named the son of Gardar, named Uni, he was Uni the Dane. He tried to win Iceland for Harald Fairhair. Both those names are attributed to him. But the locals found out. And I remember what I said. Iceland was big on independence, maintaining its independence. Kind of like every captain is a king on their own deck. Iceland was, in the early days, was like every landowner is a king on their own land. And no one's going to rule over them. They all kind of agreed on that part. So this Uni the Dane tried to win it for King Harold in secret. He was plotting, but they found out and they killed him. So Uni the Dane, he was done. Now he had a son named Hror, and Hror married Arngunnur, who was the sister of Gunnar Hamondarson, who was one of the main characters in the longest Norse saga, Njál's saga. So a little trivia for you there. And these sagas were mostly recorded in Iceland. So in general, Iceland's isolation, its distance from Norway, made it easier for them to maintain their independence. It's really hard for some Viking king, whether Harold or someone else that came after him, to subdue Iceland. You got to go a long way to go there and then fight these very independent-minded people. So there's been a lot of Viking kings that claimed Iceland without actually having any control over it. They just said it. They're just like, yeah, it's like how Aegon claimed Dorne when he didn't rule it. There's been a lot of Viking kings or Norse kings that said, yep, Iceland's mine, but it wasn't. Iceland didn't give them anything. They just couldn't gainsay, and they're like, well, you don't actually rule us, but we can't stand up on a pulpit and say that. No one's listening to us. We don't have social media. Greenland, right? Now, well, before I get to Greenland, actually, one more point. Now, consider the Long Night. This is a reason why people might have been on these islands and then died out. If the Long Night occurred and you're living in a place that's fringy in terms of human habitation, it goes from fringy to impossible. We used this example when we talked about Ragnarok and the Long Night, how a lot of the Norse world lived on the fringes of what's possible for humans to live on. So if it gets a little bit colder, it gets a little bit worse, all of a sudden you can't live there. So take that idea and apply it to Lonely Light. What if during the Long Night there were people living there long before the Farwynds, because the Farwynds didn't exist during the Long Night? What if they were there and they all died out? And then when the Farwynds did move there, well, maybe they didn't find oily black stone or any magical artifacts or heart trees, but they might have found evidence of people living there before, and it would have potentially been the Long Night that wiped them out. Could have been anything else, too. Other possibilities for getting wiped out. This place is hard to live on. Maybe they just failed. The colony could have just failed. But it's also possible there have been multiple colonies there in thousands of years ago, times long gone. To be fair, a lot of island nations had it easier during the Long Night because fish. There's still fish. The oceans didn't freeze over. And there should, still be... The oceans would be affected by the Long Night. It affects plankton, and the sunlight does matter. So their catches would be impacted, but they wouldn't be nothing, I don't think. Greenland is the last, or not the last, but the second to last, third to last island I have here. It was discovered by Gunnbjorn Ulfsson in the early 900s. And guess what? It was someone trying to sail to Iceland blown off course. So Iceland was discovered by someone blown off course, trying to go to the Faroe Islands, and Greenland was discovered by someone trying to go to Iceland blown off course. This was in the early 900s, so, 40 years, 50 years after. This guy, Snæbjorn Galti. So you have Gunnbjorn and Snæbjorn. He led the earliest intentional voyage there. So we had discovery of Greenland and then the first people that moved there on purpose, just like the process that happened in Iceland. So Snæbjorn started a colony, but it went poorly. If you saw the portrayal of Greenland in the show Vikings, once again, it went poorly. I don't think they know what details to use here. They made up their own details. Just the colonists there didn't get along. One of them kind of went mad and they started fighting each other and they didn't have enough food. Something like that really did happen in this colony. The Snæbjorn guy was murdered and the colony failed and only 2 of them got back to Iceland. So yeah, bad. Now, Eric the Red went there for banishment because he was murdered. Because he committed murder, rather. He went there because he had heard the tale of this Gunnbjorn Ulfsson. He was like, you found an island over there, Greenland? And he went there because he was banished. So he's like, well, I'm going to go to this place this Gunnbjorn guy discovered. Now, in Greenland, near Greenland, rather, is Grassland Bay, which is a part of Newfoundland. The northernmost tip of Newfoundland is this Grassland Bay. It's called L'Anse aux Meadows. It's a French-English name, which translates as Grassland Bay. It's the most remote site that we know for a fact to be settled by Norse. It's the only confirmed Norse settlement area in North America that isn't in Greenland. It's maybe referred to in the Vinland sagas, which I've read, and they're fascinating. The Vinland sagas are, sagas written in Iceland about the attempts that places discovered in North America that aren't described in a way that we can be sure of where they are. But there is a description. There's a layout of the settlement at Grassland Bay that gives us a little bit of an idea of what the basics would be. And we can port some of that over to Lonely Light and assume that some of these basics would be there too, because they would have, for the most part, only the basics, right? They wouldn't have a lot of fancy stuff. They would have the subsistence structures that you need and maybe not a whole lot else. There were left over at this Grassland Bay site were 3 halls, including one of the halls that was clearly for the leader, so for the chieftain or whatever title they had. There were a bunch of houses, some connected to the halls, some just scattered here and there. There were also huts that were for poorer people to live in or for work to get done. There was an iron smithy for forging iron, which is important. That's a big deal, which that absolutely aligns with the Ironborn. I mean, iron smithies would be pretty common around the Iron Islands, not just to forge weapons, but to exploit mineral wealth and sell the iron ore, which is something that, in particular, the Horde dynasty did. They made extra wealth by selling iron ore and being more, putting more of an effort into extracting it in the first place. There's also evidence that these Viking settlements, they traveled south to supplement their resources because they found butternuts, butternut-like shells and husks, which you cannot grow there in Greenland. Or in Newfoundland. They must have been going south to trade with someone to get these butternuts, which is kind of an interesting little tidbit there, right? Vinland Saga mentions 2 other sites. This could be, like I said, Vinland Saga describes these things, but there's not a map. So there's a place called Leifsbudir, which is where Leif Erikson founded a colony after Greenland. And that's the son of Eric the Red. He's portrayed in the show Vikings Valhalla, but not very accurately. And there's a place called Hope, which was founded by Greenlanders as well. So that could be a reference to this Grassland Bay. Finally, we have Baffin Island. It was discovered by Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni? Yes, Bjarni, the purple dinosaur. He was traveling from Iceland to Greenland. And of course, what happened? He was blown off course. So really, folks, being blown off course is a tried and true method of discovering new lands in our real world here. This site is believed to be Helluland, which is something referred to in several different Norse sagas. Baffin Island is the 5th largest island in the world. It took being blown off course to find it, though. Like, people just, the world is a big place, y'all. It's the largest island in Canada, the 2nd largest island in the Americas overall, Greenland being first. I guess if you count, because Greenland wouldn't be the first, would it? I guess it'd have to be, but but this is the largest in Canada. Isn't Greenland part of Canada? Anyway, I don't know what's going on here. Regardless, the Baffin Mountains are all named after Norse gods. There's a Thor, an Odin, and an Asgard, and the Thor mountain has the greatest sheer cliff face drop on Earth. A 4,100 foot sheer face cliff drop. That is wild. That's almost a mile. So it's fitting that George R. R. Martin made the Ironborn similar, because they're already similar to Vikings in a lot of ways. A similar level of discovering things, discovering land by being blown off course, or other similar methods, though not necessarily as aggressive settling places, definitely as aggressive in finding them. A little bit about accents. Island folk can have accents. In fact, it's common. As we said, the farther out you are, the more extreme the accents might be. You know, the Farwynds having kind of their own dialect of Ironborn might be there. I mean, Ironborn isn't a language, but they would have an accent or a dialect too. Tarth, people of Tarth probably have a bit of an accent. Maybe only a Stormlander would notice that. Like, to a lot of us, if you go to Ireland, there's a lot of different Irish accents, but if you don't know them, they all just sound Irish to you. A native would be able to identify a variety of different Irish accents. So I think this is what we probably are dealing with here. It's not something George gets into a lot of detail on, but it's likely because this is just how humanity works. So there's probably even a Great Wyk dialect of sorts, and this would be an offshoot of that. So it's like a dialect of a dialect. So it might be kind of off to some people. But it's not portrayed that way. Like, Aaron doesn't describe Gilbert Farwynd as having like a weird voice, but he just does think of them as weird in general, and that would be kind of fitting. I don't have an actual sound in mind, but I do imagine them having an accent. Farwynd timeline and history, at least our best guesses. So Lonely Light was discovered 1,000 years after the time of Brendan the Burner. That doesn't tell us a lot, like I said, because we don't know when Brendan the Burner's time was either. But we do know that Brandon the Burner's time was thousands of years before the conquest. So if we take 1,000 years minus thousands of years, we have at least 1,000 left. Wyman Manderley actually says the burning, Brandon's burning was centuries ago, which is, he's clearly underselling it a bit, but it does imply that we're talking about maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years rather than some larger, 4,000 to 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The heyday of the Ironborn was long before 1,000 years ago. I briefly touched on this at the beginning. Perhaps halfway through the Age of Heroes, roughly, was when they were actually at their peak. That's when they ruled large portions of the entire West Coast. Corrid the Cruel sacked Old Town and won battles in the field, pitched battles. So, the First Men hadn't really figured out the best ways to defend against the Ironborn, or even against each other, really. There weren't a lot of stone castles yet, even. So, the world was riper for them. So even though the Farwynds didn't grow power or prestige from that era, or stories, certainly the Ironborn advanced and set the stage for future houses like them. After Corrid, Ironborn power declined slowly. Corrid was the peak. They lost Casey, they lost Fair Isle, they lost the Arbor, they lost Flint's Finger, they had Bear Island. The mainland kept getting stronger, more stone castles, more savvy defense, more understanding of Ironborn tactics. The Ironborn still had victories, but the decline was apparent. This focus to the east maybe helps us explain why Lonely Light was never discovered. Or maybe it was discovered and just got ignored because it's poor and no one wanted to live there. No one's like, I want to live there. Even though people did eventually move there, in this era, maybe they didn't care to. Maybe the first person to find it already had land and couldn't be bothered to care about this. Or maybe there's just some other reason. Maybe just shunned for some reason that's been lost to time. Moving forward a little bit was the era when Euron Red Hand of House Grey Iron ended King's Moots until the time of the books by killing everyone there. And that basically created the Kingdom of the Iron Isles. From then, it was the Seastone Chair or the Crown of the Iron Isles, whichever. Then came the Andals, and even the Iron Isles were overrun as much as the mainland was, though a little later. And then from there, we can fast forward a bit to the Black Line. This refers to the final dynasty of Ironborn kings. The Black Line were the Hoare kings, Hoare, who ruled for quite some time, but most likely were the ones in charge when House Farwynd was founded. They had the throne for a long time, and they were the last ones to hold it when the conquest came. So they were the last Ironborn dynasty, basically. They have a complicated reputation. Most famous to us are the ones at the end of the dynasty. Harwin Hardhand and Harren the Black, who built Harrenhal and died to Balerion. Harwin's the one who took the Riverlands from the Storm Kings. So those guys don't give the house a good reputation. But in the earlier days, for an Ironborn house, which the bar is low, they were actually somewhat progressive and pushed the Ironborn to be more humane and to be more ethical, which is, it didn't really work. And they didn't call it ethical or humane. Those words don't register among the Ironborn, but it is the bottom line of what was happening. They were trying to bring the Ironborn more into the fold with the rest of Westeros. Not as a path to being more humane or being high-minded. No, it was a power thing. There's more power in the mainland. The Hoars wanted some of that. That's part of where that's resulted in things like the conquest of the Stormland or the Riverlands and the building of Harrenhal. So there was a lot of things like this. They tried to push the Seven. They tried to push this and that. There was a lot of things that way. More trade, more travel. They discouraged reaving. Yeah, they were the cultural bridge between the two, which made them unpopular with some parts of the Ironborn community and more popular with others. They were first from Orkmont, the Hoare dynasty. But over time, they acquired land all throughout the Iron Isles, which includes the castle on Great Wyk that is now no longer there, that was destroyed. There was a time when ships at Orkmont became common at Lannisport, Old Town, and the Free Cities. Trade for a while, was a big deal for the Ironborn. They were fully moving in that direction. Less reaving, more trading. Everybody's probably like, yay, finally, they're not doing that. What a great thing. Obviously, that they were some backsliding there. But this is a great candidate for when the Farwynds came to be. A time when there was more exploring, more time for things other than fighting. That's a sensible time, since it also fits the chronology for this discovery or rediscovery of the isles that are now Lonely Light. So yeah, it's a huge amount of guesswork here, but it's a pretty fitting place to imagine it falling. House Hoare even married into House Lannister for a while. Ironically, this marriage, which was intended to further that bridge, to close the gap between Ironborn and the mainland, actually started a big setback. Started a chain of events, a domino effect that ultimately resulted in, well, the connection getting worse rather than closer. The distance grew because there was a lot of pushback from the devout. The Shrike, a priest of the drowned god, led a religious revolt, which included mutilating Dowager Queen Layla Lannister, which upset the West, understandably, which led to an invasion of the Iron Isles, something that's happened very few times from the mainland. And this guy who led it, Aubrey Craycall, who was in charge of the mission, also oddly, rather than just vanquishing the Ironborn and returning home, decided, you know what? Why not make myself king of the Ironborn? What a strange decision. Yeah, like a Craycall could be king over the Ironborn. The Shrike got him too. Yeah, he was killed pretty quickly. He only lived about 6 months. But before Aubrey Craycall was put down by the Shrike, he had Hoare Castle destroyed. So it was a way to push back against them, a way to establish himself probably, which, you know, he wasn't able. He didn't stick around for the long term to work on that, but he did do something pretty meaningful there. Now, House Hoare kept the crown after this. They got it back after this Craycall business was done. But they didn't rebuild that castle, which, again, this fits really well as a candidate for a shakeup on Great Wyk, which is how the Farwynds of Sealskin Point were created. Because the Farwynds of Sealskin Point definitely came along after the Farwynds of Lonely Light. So we have to ask ourselves, how did the Farwynds of Lonely Light acquire land on Great Wyk? Well, our best guess is during this era when the Hoares lost their possessions there and decided not to reclaim them. They were still kings. They could have taken it back. They just didn't care for some reason, probably because their focus was so very much on the east. They were way more concerned with the mainland. Great Wyk is as far west as the Iron Isles get, except for Lonely Light. So you can see why they just said, I don't care. I don't want to spend all this money to rebuild a castle when we're trying to establish ourselves on mainland Westeros, which is way more potential for us. The Conquest and beyond. The Conquest massively reduced the infighting and warring between the major kingdoms. For the Ironborn, it was a bit different, right? Though they have certainly had wars in their history, plenty of them. Mostly they just raid and get people mad at them. That's not really a war. That's just a constant state of affairs that is violent and, you know, inconsistent, but certainly doesn't stop except for very short periods of time. They don't usually get into full-scale wars, and when they did, it was usually long ago. Nowadays, that happens less. It did happen somewhat under the Hoare dynasty because they were trying to conquer parts of the mainland. So they definitely had mainland wars, but those were mainland wars. That isn't going to involve their navy very much, which would keep people like the Farwynds not very involved. So the growing strength of various kingdoms by this era, which is 100 years before the conquest, 50 years before the conquest, that time, the strength of various kingdoms was way beyond what it had been when the Ironborn were in their heyday. All that slow development of the kingdom, the slow addition of more and more stone castles, which generally don't go away. Most castles, once they're built, they stick around. So just over time, it just got harder and harder for the Ironborn to do their thing, but it didn't stop them. It just got harder. So the conquest stopped it altogether. Now, we're told that already the raiding in the mainland had slowed down because of the growing strength of the mainland, so a lot more Ironborn were raiding far away from Westeros, sailing to places like the Basilisk Isles, the Stepstones, maybe the Summer Isles, maybe even farther east than the Basilisk Isles, what have you. So that was an extra adaptation or an extra thing they'd have to change under Aegon. They're like, well, we're already banned from, we were already not raiding the mainland very often. Now we're banned from doing it, and we're not going to piss off the dragons. Even the Greyjoys were smart about that. There may still have been a little here and there, raiding a small village here and there, fishing village, what have you, something that wouldn't get a lot of attention. But yeah, the raiding of the West Coast and anywhere in Westeros came to a screeching halt with the conquest, and it was already going pretty slowly. So again, this takes us back to the Farwynds being probably quite skilled at long-distance travel, even for people that use long ships, which are in some ways not ideal for that. Because they had to. By necessity, you have to travel from the Iron Islands all the way around Westeros to get to the Basilisk Isles or the Stepstones. And, well, for the Farwynds, it's even farther. They have the farthest trip of any of that group. So they have an extra week or two built into any trip they plan. So that's difficult, right? The Ironborn are known for capitalizing on civil conflict. Whenever there was a civil war, whether it was Maegor versus Aegon, or whether it was a Dance of the Dragons later when the Red Kraken made a very lasting example of this concept. When the mainland gets to fighting itself, when it's distracted with itself, perfect time for the Ironborn to make their moves. The Farwynds would be involved in this as very much as anyone else, you would think. In fact, they might be more looking for such opportunities given their scarcities and the things that they need and the lack of resources. On the other hand, they might be slow to find out that there's these opportunities because they're not getting ravens and they have such a long distance between the mainland and themselves. One benefit, a silver lining of being isolated, is they would certainly feel the pinch or the pain or the suffering of things like the shivering or the Great Spring Sickness less. They would be able to cut themselves off from such things. Once it arrives on your island, you have a hard time dealing with it. But if you can avoid it coming to your island in the first place, maybe by shutting the port down or just nobody travel to the mainland for a while, you got a better chance of avoiding it or the worst of it or avoiding it entirely. And once the country recovers a bit from the plague, once the plague isn't running rampant, but people still, the setbacks are still there, perfect time to go reaving, isn't it? You might be surprised to learn that the Great Council of 101, where Viserys was chosen over Laenor Velaryon, was attended by the Farwynds. So they were kind of an example of showing how far and wide lords traveled to make it to this Great Council. They're like, even the Farwynds came. Like, it's hard to name someone that would have had to travel farther. So that's kind of cool. We're told the Lord of Lonely Light showed up, but we don't get his name. I bet they voted for Laenor, right? Favor the Seaborn guy. Favor the Velaryons. Favor the sailors, you know? So nowadays, do they still sail to raid the Basilisk Isles, the Stepstones, and elsewhere? Probably. Asha did it as a child, as a younger person. She thinks of her going with Carl the Maid to raid Lyseni pirates. You know, the pirates steal from other people and they steal from them. So why not raiders from Lonely Light or Sealskin Point doing that sort of thing? If Asha's doing it, why not them? In fact, it seems more likely given, once again, their needs are greater. Now, Balon's rebellions were not very successful. They were an attempt to get back to pre-conquest times, the old way, right? The very old way. This was kind of impossible because pre-conquest, the Seven Kings were not one. He wasn't going to get things back to the time when there was no Iron Throne. That kind of rebellion wasn't happening. But his idea was that the Iron Throne wasn't what it was, that Robert would not be able to get the kind of support that the Targaryens did. He was wrong, but that was his idea. But I think the Farwynds were probably pretty enthusiastic about this because, again, they really need raiding. They want to raid. And it's hard to punish them for it because they're so far away, right? And what are you going to do? Tax them more? Like, what taxes are they even paying in the first place? You know, sail all the way to their islands to root them out? It's just a pain for very little, right? So I think that they were probably pro Balon's rebellions unless they realized, like a lot of other people did, that it was a bad idea. They wanted the result. Maybe they didn't think the idea was good, but that was probably their dilemma. But maybe they were crazy about it, like Balon himself. Now, but Balon gave up Theon. The war came to Pike. The Farwynds probably suffered for this war. Probably the second one too. They're probably suffering for Baelin's second rebellion as well, which is still ongoing, which Euron has taken over. Maybe less, though. Maybe it's coming. Let's finish with the actual King's Moot, which is where we started. Aeron announced the moot at Pebbleton, as I said, which is the opposite end of Great Wyk from Sealskin Point. He stopped by Hammerhorn, which is right by Sealskin Point. He didn't go there, which Aeron doesn't think much of the Farwynds, so it makes sense that he would avoid them. He wouldn't make a special stop just for them. An angle to the King's Moot that is oddly familiar, that even Gilbert Farwynd is suggesting, is that so many of the claimants have a plan to move elsewhere. Euron wants to give them all of Westeros. He's like, yeah, well, I'm going to give you all of Westeros. It's a grand, highfalutin scheme. But it is an idea, a plan to move, to migrate. And under him, they've had some success so far. They got the shields, that's something. That's a case in point, even though he's probably going to lose them and expects to lose them and kind of wants to lose them because he put people there that he wanted to get rid of. Asha as well. She was like, yeah, let's make friends with the Northerners. Let's give them back most of the North, but keep some of it and settle there. So Gilbert's suggesting a similar thing, even though it's a crazier version of this. He still is like, yeah, let's move. 3 different claimants at the King's Moot were like, let's move. Well, an irony could be that while Gilbert is wrong about the lack of winter, surely, about these lands to the west, he might actually be telling the truth, just in a very dreamy and way filtered through all these dreams and visions that he might be having, or seeing it through Skinchanger. Maybe he's a Skinchanger. Maybe he saw through the eyes of a wolf of the Western Sea. And so maybe that's just a fact of them being rare, right? An ancestor of his, a powerful Skinchanger, even though we're open to the idea of some Farwynd Skinchangers here and there, they still would be very rare, just like they seem to be anywhere. So we're not saying it's a common thing, but when it does happen, assuming it does, then you've got something pretty memorable to the house. The other Farwynds would, they would remember this rare occasion, especially if this powerful Skinchanger brought them wealth or power or prestige. We assume they accept Euron as their king, not the entirety of the Iron Islands has. We don't exactly have a list, do we? If there is a connection between Farwynd and Euron, then that's even more likely. Otherwise, he's a different kind of madman and dreamer than Gilbert, one that they might actually kind of grok with, but maybe not, because his vision is to the east and they want to go west. But still, this is a man with a grand vision for the future of the Ironborn, and if they're open to grand plans like Gilbert's, then maybe they liked Euron's. And he also gave away so much loot. There's always something to be said for giving a bunch of Reavers and Raiders loot to make them happy. He surely did that. But afterwards, when Euron is all said and done, presumably he fails, but after doing a whole lot, causing a lot of damage, some of that kickback may hit the Iron Islands, and they might be like, yeah, maybe we're done with grand visions for a little while. But maybe not. The Red Kraken didn't turn them off, and the backlash to his era was horrible. And the things that happened to the Ironborn after the Red Kraken fell were terrible, but they don't seem to blame him for that. So maybe they wouldn't blame Euron either. Hopefully we get more about this unique and creepy house. Is there a connection to Euron? Is there a connection to something in the West? Do we truly have this unique situation with maritime Skinchangers? The ideas alone have a lot of potential, even without real answers. Even though this is a house with scant details for storytelling potential, there's a lot here. George once again makes his fringiest characters, houses, locations more compelling than the main locations of a lot of other popular fantasy worlds. His fringy stuff is better than a lot of people's main stuff. And that says a lot. That's why we love it so much. It gives us this opportunity to play in the sandbox, even though it's more of an ocean. And those of you who are into world building, if you play like role-playing games, this stuff is just manna from heaven. Like George is a great supplier of ideas for campaigns, for characters, for realms. There's so much here. Jump and Slash says Greenland is Danish territory. Oh yeah, I think I used to know that and forgot. That explains it. Yeah, Greenland is Danish territory of Denmark. So yeah, it's not Canadian, so that would make sense. Even though it's right next to Canada, that's why it's not included as Canadian territory. So Newfoundland, or Baffin Island is the biggest in Canada. Cool. Trivia answer. The question again was, there was Alyssa Farman and Brandon the Shipwright, but which Greyjoy wanted to explore the West beyond the Lonely Light? As detailed in this episode, it was Alton Greyjoy, the Holy Fool, a great-grandfather to Balon, Euron, Victarion, all those guys. We don't know how many greats to put on that. Great-grandfather? Great maybe, but not super far in the past. Somewhere in the vicinity of the 200s, something like that. Sometime after Dagon Greyjoy. And Dagon Greyjoy's heyday was like 210 to 218-ish. So this guy's probably in the 30s or 40s. So yeah, maybe only like 50 years ago. How did our poll go, Shea? What do people think there? The question again was, are they actually skin changers, and are they actually connected to lands to the west? I forget which order I put it, but you'll tell me. Here we go. The answer is, drum roll please while I scroll back here. It is, have the Farwynds discovered lands to the west, and are they skin changers? 45% of you said yes to both. Almost half say yes to both. 8% of you think no to both. 28% say yes to lands to the west, no to skin changers. 19% said no to lands to the west, yes to skin changers. That's pretty cool. I tend to lean yes, partly because it's the most fun. But hey, it's all guesswork here, so why not have fun with it? Everybody answers this question the way that I think appeals to them the most, because it's all very imagination-based. It's all rooted in that, and we're all supposed to be having fun here. Some episodes that I named that are related to this one: Great Empire of the Dawn, our Ashai episodes, which related to that one, House Velaryon, House Mormont, and we've done some episodes on Old Town that relate to the High Tower that is vaguely related as well. Some of the history of Old Town and the Reach is very connected to Ironborn history. As far as other skin changers, we've got episodes on Bloodraven, quite a few of those, especially the third one, because the first ones on Bloodraven deal with his time as more of a political operator. But the third one, the Three-Eyed Bloodraven, deals with his life after going to the Wall. I'm sure there's some other ones I'm forgetting because our catalog is just so very deep these days. We got hundreds and hundreds of episodes. I'm sure we talk about some of these concepts elsewhere, but that's a start for you. And that's all we have for you today. Thanks to Nina for her great takes. Thanks to Joey Townsend for our intro music. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for our video intro and for the maps you see behind us. That's Klaradox, claradox.de if you want to get your own copies of his maps. And on behalf of Ashea, I'm Aziz, and we'll see you next time. You know what to do until then. Valar Rereadus.